there's, again, three kinds of chemistry: spiritual, earthly, and scientific. And I'm going to look at that. One of the things that I'm sure you've heard of the word alchemy. What word in English comes from alchemy? I mean, your kids are taking classes called alchemy. Chemistry. They take Jabir and they take alchemy. Yeah, chemistry. One of the things that, and it means the change. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about a little bit was the spiritual alchemy first, and then earthly and scientific. And one of the people, of course, that's really, really famous is this one, Jabir ibn Hayyan, who's showing up in our textbooks now. And it's being spelled as Geber, Geber. But he lived from 721 to 815. And by spiritual alchemy, what I'm talking about on that one is transformation of the soul, transformation of a human, not the idea, the earthly idea of let's take lead and turn it into gold. And when you read about alchemy, a lot of books will say it was an effort to take lead and turn it into gold. And it did actually sort of sink down to that level of, I think we can take lead and turn it into gold. Oh, whoops, no, we can't. And so there were actually gallows in some of the courts where the kings were hanging their alchemists because they were not able to turn lead into gold as they had promised. But spiritual alchemy was far more important, and our books don't talk a whole lot about that. But it's really the transformation of a self-centered, egotistic kind of soul into a servant of God. And one of the things that they did in terms of the scientific one, they have the spiritual one of turning a person who's sort of not quite right spiritually into somebody who is spiritually doing quite well. And then the earthly one, let's turn lead into gold. And then the scientific one, scientific alchemy. And one of the things that's interesting with scientific alchemy is they came up with this idea of when you're working in your experiments, you should be able to observe. They decided what you should do is observe some aspect of the universe, make a tentative description of it called a hypothesis, use this hypothesis to make a prediction, test those predictions, and if they don't come right, do some further observations, find out why not, and then get it to the point where it does, hopefully, and keep repeating this hypothesis and these predictions and these tests until you finally get to the point where there's no discrepancy between what you think is going to happen and what actually happens in your scientific experiment. So what I'm looking at here, what I'm describing here is what's called the scientific process. It's really the scientific method. And your textbooks will say that Roger Bacon came up with that in the 13th century in England. But it's really something that, this may sound like common sense to us, like, well, duh, but it really wasn't. I mean, one of the things that's kind of interesting is there's writings with medieval scholars about optics, for instance, a lot of that. And one of the things that they said was that we see things by shooting rays out of our eyes. And there's perfect proof in it, because if you close your eyes, you don't see anything. So I've just gotten rid of those rays. My eyes are shut. I don't see a thing. I open them back up. I just proved to you I've got rays coming out of my eyes, and that's how I see you. And so that's the kind of science that was being done. So this whole idea of the scientific method was, again, considered pretty wild. One other thing that's kind of interesting about Geber, this guy over here, is that he started using a sort of language that he didn't want other people to understand, and so alchemists sort of started to create their own language. And it's kind of a language that other people purposely are not supposed to understand, and we get our word gibberish from that, because you're speaking the way that Jabir spoke. Let me move on. Okay, Nicholas Flamel is probably the most famous European alchemist. And one of the things that happened was this idea of alchemy looking at the soul as something that can be changed and turned into something beautiful instead of something ugly and greedy and self-centered, became really popular among Christian mystics because they saw in it a symbol of Christ's death and resurrection. And so they started studying alchemy as well. So by the 12th century, a lot of the Arab alchemical textbooks were then being translated and sent up to Northern Europe and really being picked up by the alchemists up there who liked it a lot. I'm going to move on to medicine. And again, you've got a question of why Islam? I mean, what is it about practices, religious practices that would have to do with hygiene, cleanliness, medicine, body, take care of your body, clean your body, keep your body pure? Ablutions. Yeah, they're washing 5 times a day. So it's one of the things that, and then also, there's more to it. There's actually, that's one of them, that's very obvious. And then there's also this attitude that there is a divinely ordained balance in life. And illness, this is very Greco-Roman, same thing in Greece, same thing in Rome, that when you are ill, you're ill because there's an imbalance. And even today, it's sort of considered New Age to say you're sick because you're imbalanced, and that's something that actually goes back centuries and centuries and centuries. But I'll be looking at a physician by the name of Al-Razi, and he wrote a really nice philosophy of medicine where he said, a lack of desire and a lack of anger is what makes you happy. And so you have to create a balance within yourself so that you can have a balance within the rest of the world. And again, it's this idea of take care of yourself first, because you need to take care of that before you can move on to other stuff. So he said that he wrote that we actually have a religious obligation to live simply and be satisfied with what we have.